September 11th, 1948, 9:37 p.m. The back room of Rao's restaurant on East 114th Street in East Harlem, a small establishment with only 4 tables that had operated as neutral territory for meetings between different criminal organizations since opening in 1896, where Giuseppe Joe Rowe maintained strict policies requiring reservations months in advance and enforcing absolute confidentiality regarding conversations that occurred within walls, that had witnessed decades of negotiations and threats and deals between gangsters who needed locations where conflicts could be discussed without immediate risk of violence that might erupt if meetings happened in territories controlled by one faction or another. The back room was separated from the main dining area by a heavy curtain, furnished with a single round table, surrounded by 6 wooden chairs, lit by a single overhead lamp that cast shadows in corners, where 2 bodyguards stood watching exits and monitoring everyone's movements, with the kind of professional vigilance that came from years of protecting bosses whose survival depended on noticing threats before they materialized into actual attacks. Frank Costello sat at the head of the table, a 57-year-old Italian-American who had served as acting boss of the Luciano crime family since 1937, when Vito Genovese fled to Italy to avoid murder charges. Someone whose intelligence and diplomatic skills had earned him the nickname Prime Minister of the Underworld from associates who recognized that his power derived more from political connections and strategic thinking than from violence or intimidation that characterized other mob bosses who maintained control through fear rather than through respect and mutual benefit that Costello cultivated carefully over decades of building relationships with Tammany Hall politicians and judges and police officials who provided protection and favorable treatment in exchange for money and political support that Costello delivered reliably. Costello wore an expensive dark suit with a silk tie, his graying hair slicked back in the style that remained fashionable among Italian mobsters who wanted to project image of legitimate businessmen rather than criminals, his expression neutral as he waited for the other participants in tonight's meeting to arrive and take their seats around the table where important matters regarding Harlem's gambling operations would be discussed and hopefully resolved without creating conflicts that would be bad for everyone's business. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson entered the back room at 9:42 p.m., accompanied by a single associate whose presence communicated that Bumpy felt secure enough in this neutral setting to arrive without the multiple bodyguards that usually surrounded him when he traveled through Harlem or visited locations where potential enemies might be present. Bumpy was 42 years old in September 1948, at TAI's peak of his power and influence in Harlem's criminal underworld. Bumpy nodded respectfully to Costello, who gestured toward chair to his right, acknowledging the relationship that had existed between them since the mid-1930s, when Bumpy had negotiated the deal allowing black bookmakers in Harlem to maintain independence in exchange for paying tribute to the Italian Mafia, an arrangement that had proven profitable for both sides and that had established Bumpy as the first black crime boss to achieve genuine partnership rather than subordination with New York's Italian mob families. The final participant arrived at 9:46 p.m. Anthony Tony Tablay Benedetto, a 31-year-old capo in the Genovese family who controlled gambling operations in parts of the Bronx and who had recently been expressing interest in expanding his territory to include sections of northern Harlem that traditionally fell under Bumpy's control. Someone whose aggressive ambition and lack of historical knowledge about previous conflicts made him dangerous in ways. When Dutch Schultz attempted to take over Harlem as numbers, racket through violence and intimidation that ultimately failed when Schultz was murdered by the National Crime Syndicate in 1935. Benedetto was tall and muscular, his dark hair pomaded, his suit flashy rather than understated, his bearing communicating the kind of aggressive confidence that came from someone who had killed multiple people during his rise through Genovese family ranks and who believed that his willingness to use violence gave him advantages over opponents who might be smarter or more strategic, but who supposedly lacked his ruthless determination to take what he wanted regardless of consequences. If you've ever watched someone dismiss a calm warning because they mistook quietness for weakness, because they confused strategic patience with inability to act, leave a comment about the moment when you realized that the person everyone underestimated was actually the most dangerous one in the room, and subscribe to this channel because what you're about to witness is how Tony Benedetto's laughter at Bumpy Johnson's warning became the biggest mistake of his criminal career, leading to set hours that transformed him from arrogant capo to desperate man begging Frank Costello for mercy that might not come. Costello began the meeting by stating the purpose that had brought these three men together tonight. Gentlemen, we here to discuss concerns that have been raised about territorial boundaries in Harlem and to ensure that everyone understands arrangements that have been in place since 1935 regarding how operations are organized in that neighborhood. Tony, you've been making moves in northern Harlem over the past 2 months, running new numbers, operations, and bookmaking establishments in areas that traditionally belong to Bumpy's organization. Bumpy has brought these activities to my attention, and I've called this meeting to clarify expectations and hopefully resolve any misunderstandings before they escalate into conflicts that would be bad for business. Costello's tone was diplomatic, carefully avoiding language that would seem to take sides before hearing both perspectives, but his choice to frame Benedetto's actions as moves rather than violations or incursions already communicated subtle criticism, suggesting that the younger capo had overstepped boundaries that should have been respected. Benedetto responded with a kind of dismissive confidence that immediately created tension in the room. Mr. Costello, with all due respect, the arrangements you're talking about were made 13 years ago when circumstances were different. Harlem has changed since 1935. The population has grown. There's more money flowing through those neighborhoods. And, frankly, I don't understand why we re-letting a black operator control territory that could be generating significantly more revenue if it was managed by people who have experience running large-scale operations with proper organization and accounting systems. I'm not trying to disrespect anyone, but the reality is that Bumpy runs a small-time operation compared to what we could build. If the family took direct control over Harlem's gambling, the statement revealed several things simultaneously: that Benedetto genuinely believed Bumpy's operation was small-time, despite generating hundreds of thousands of dollars annually, that he viewed the 1935 agreement as temporary expedient rather than permanent arrangement, that he saw black operators as inferior to Italian management, and that he lacked understanding of why Costello and other senior mob leaders had maintained this partnership arrangement for more than a decade despite having theoretical power to simply take over Harlem's operations through force. Costello's expression remained neutral, but his eyes narrowed slightly, a subtle indication of displeasure that more observant people would have recognized as warning sign that Benedetto's approach was not being well received. Bumpy sat quietly, showing no visible reaction to Benedetto's characterization of his organization as small-time, or to the implicit racism and suggestions that Italian management would be superior to black management of Harlem's gambling operations. Costello responded carefully, choosing words that would educate Benedetto without directly insulting him in front of Bumpy. Tony, the reason we've maintained these arrangements for 13 years is because we lack power to change them. It's because these arrangements work well for everyone involved. Bumpy's organization generates substantial revenue while maintaining community relationships that keep operations running smoothly without constant police interference or community opposition that would create problems requiring us to spend more money on protection and political favors than we currently spend. The deal we made in 1935 has proven its value over more than a decade of profitable cooperation, and changing it now would create risks that do and justify whatever additional revenue you believe we could extract by taking direct control. The explanation was diplomatic but firm, communicating that Costello viewed the existing arrangement as successful rather than as temporary expedient that should be reconsidered. But Benedetto either didn't understand the warning embedded in Costello's words or chose to ignore it because he believed his position was strong enough to challenge the existing arrangement despite his boss's clear indication that changes were not being contemplated. Mr. Costello, I understand your perspective, but I think you're underestimating how much money we're losing by maintaining this arrangement. I've done research on Harlem's numbers operations, and I estimate that Bumpy's organization generates approximately $400,000 annually in gross revenue, of which we receive about $70,000 as tribute. If we took direct control, we could easily double or triple that revenue through better organization and expansion into territories that Bumpy is currently serving effectively. That's an additional $600,000 to $800,000 annually that we are leaving on the table. because we re-honoring an agreement that made sense during wartime but that doesn't make sense during peacetime. At precisely this moment, everyone in the room who understood power dynamics in New York's criminal underworld recognized that Tony Benedetto was making a catastrophic error in judgment by persisting in his challenge to arrangements that Frank Costello had just defended, by implicitly criticizing his boss's and by dismissing Bumpy Johnson's capabilities in ways that showed profound ignorance about who Bumpy actually was and what he actually controlled. Have you ever seen someone make an argument so confidently that they failed to notice that everyone else in the room knew they were wrong, that their supposed expertise was actually revealing their ignorance? Leave a comment about the most spectacular case of overconfidence you've witnessed. And subscribe now, because Tony Benedetto is about to learn that his research about Bumpy Johnson's organization was so incomplete and so wrong that his mistake will cost him everything he has built over the past decade of climbing through Genevieve's family ranks. Bumpy finally spoke, his voice quiet but carrying unmistakable authority that came from someone accustomed to being heard without needing to raise his voice or make threats. Mr. Benedetto, your research is incomplete. My organization doesn't generate $400,000 annually. It generates approximately $2,800,000 annually in gross revenue from numbers operations, bookmaking, and other gambling activities conducted throughout Harlem. The $70,000 we pay annually to Mr. Costello's organization represents approximately 2.5% of gross revenue, not 17.5% as your calculations assume. Your estimate of my operations is off by a factor of 7, which suggests that your research methodology needs significant improvement. Before you use it to make strategic recommendations about taking over territories you want understand. The correction was delivered matter-of-factly, without anger or defensiveness, simply stating facts that contradicted Benedetto's assumptions in ways that made clear how fundamentally wrong his analysis had been. Benedetto's face flushed red, a combination of embarrassment at being corrected so definitively, and anger at being challenged by someone he viewed as subordinate, despite Bumpy's obvious partnership status with Costello. Instead of acknowledging his error and retreating from position that had been shown to be based on completely inaccurate information, Benedetto doubled down with a response that would prove to be the single most consequential statement of his criminal career. Mr. Johnson, I don't believe those numbers. There's no way your organization generates $2.8 million annually from Harlem gambling. That would make you one of the largest numbers operators in New York City, which is absurd for someone running operations out of pool halls and barbershops with runners who collect nickels and dimes from poor people. I think you're inflating your revenue figures to make yourself seem more important than you actually are, and I think Mr. Costello should send auditors into Harlem to verify actual revenue before making decisions about territorial arrangements based on claims that impossibly be accurate. The accusation that Bumpy was lying about his revenue hung in the air for several seconds, while Costello's expression transformed from diplomatic neutrality to cold anger at Benedetto's breach of protocol and calling another crime boss a liar during a meeting that was supposed to resolve disputes rather than escalate them into personal conflicts. Costello spoke before Bumpy could respond. Tony, you're out of line. Bumpy has operated in Harlem for 15 years, with complete transparency about his operations and finances. We have audited his books multiple times over the past decade, and his figures are accurate. Your suggestion that he's lying is disrespectful and inappropriate, and you need to apologize immediately. The command was delivered with absolute authority, making clear that Costello viewed Benedetto's accusation as serious violation of norms governing how bosses treated each other during negotiations, even when they disagreed about territorial issues or business arrangements. But instead of apologizing, Benedetto laughed a short, dismissive sound that communicated contempt for both Bumpy's claimed revenue figures and for Costello's defense of those figures. Mr. Costello, with all due respect, I think you've been fooled by a con artist who has been inflating his numbers for years while he accepted his claims without proper verification. Nobody generates $2.8 million annually from Harlem numbers operations. It's mathematically impossible given the neighborhood's population and the amount people can afford to bet. I'm not trying to be disrespectful, but I think we need to face reality here. Bumpy Johnson is running a modest operation that he has misrepresented as something much larger, and we've been making strategic decisions based on false information. The laughter and the accusation that Costello had been fooled represented such a profound violation of respect and protocol that everyone in the room recognized immediately that this meeting was no longer about territorial disputes, but rather about whether Tony Benedetto would survive the consequences of publicly insulting two of the most powerful crime bosses in New York, while demonstrating ignorance about basic facts regarding Harlem's operations. September 14, 1948, 2:18 p.m. Frank Costello's office in the majestic apartments on Central Park West, an elegant space furnished with expensive desk and leather chairs and artwork that communicated the wealth and sophistication that Costello had cultivated as part of his image as legitimate businessman rather than gangster. Though everyone who entered this office understood perfectly well that the real business conducted here had nothing to do with the real estate, investments and import-export companies that Costello used to explain his income to tax authorities, and that his power derived from control over gambling and political corruption rather than from any legal commercial activities. Costello sat behind his desk, reviewing papers, his expression grim. When his secretary informed him that Tony Benedetto was outside requesting urgent meeting, Costello checked his watch. 72 hours and 37 minutes had elapsed since the disastrous meeting at Rowe's restaurant, where Benedetto had laughed at Bumpy Johnson's warning and accused him of inflating revenue figures to deceive the Genovese family about his actual importance. Tony Benedetto entered Costello's office looking dramatically different from the confident, aggressive capo who had dismissed Bumpy Johnson's capabilities 3 days earlier. His expensive suit was wrinkled and stained, his face unshaven, his eyes red from apparent lack of sleep, his hands trembling slightly as he crossed the room and stood before Costello's desk without waiting for invitation to sit. The physical transformation was so complete that Costello's impulse was concerned that Benedetto had been beaten or tortured. But closer examination revealed no visible injuries whatever had happened. To reduce this formerly arrogant young mobster to his current state had been psychological rather than physical, a demonstration of power that had broken Benedetto's spirit without leaving marks that would heal over time. Costello gestured toward the chair facing his desk. "Sit down, Tony. You look terrible. What happened?" Benedetto remained standing, his voice shaking as he spoke rapidly, words tumbling over each other in rush to explain situation before Costello lost patience with his obvious distress. "Mr. Costello, I need your help. I need you to call off Bumpy Johnson. I need you to tell him I apologize for what I said at the meeting, that I was wrong about everything, that I respect his operation, and I'll never go near Harlem again. Please, you have to help me. He's destroying everything I've built. My operations in the Bronx are completely shut down. Nobody will take bets anymore because their families have been threatened. My bookmakers have all quit and won't answer my calls. My suppliers woe undelivered because they've been warned that doing business with me will result in problems with their other clients. My protection payments to police have been rejected and returned with messages saying that cops won't work with me anymore on orders from someone higher up in the department. Every business I own or control has been visited by building inspectors and health department officials and fire marshals who are finding violations that require me to shut down temporarily for repairs or renovations. The banks, where I keep my money, have frozen my accounts pending investigations into suspicious transactions. Even my goddamn phone company cut off my service this morning, claiming I violated terms of service somehow. Everything is falling apart simultaneously. And it all started exactly 72 hours ago after that meeting where I laughed at his warning. Please, Mr. Costello, make it stop. I'll do anything. I'll pay whatever he wants. I'll leave New York, if necessary. Just make him stop destroying my life. If you're feeling what Frank Costello felt in this moment, the absolute shock of watching a confident mobster reduced to begging wreck in 72 hours through strategic power that left no fingerprints, no bait, no evidence of direct action, then you need to hit that like button and subscribe right now. Because what Tony Benedetto is about to learn is that Bumpy Johnson's true power was untinned to violence that Benedetto expected, but rather in the invisible networks of economic control and political influence that Bumpy had spent 15 years building throughout New York City. Networks that allowed him to systematically dismantle someone's entire criminal empire without ever directly threatening them or breaking any laws that could be proven in court. Costello listened to Benedetto's desperate recitation of catastrophes that had befallen him over the past 72 hours, his expression revealing nothing about whether he felt sympathy or contempt for the young capo who had ignored his warnings about respecting arrangements that existed for good reasons. When Benedetto finally finished speaking and stood gasping for breath like someone who had just run a marathon, Costello spoke quietly. "Tony! Sit down! You're making me nervous standing there shaking like that. Sit down, take a breath, and explain to me exactly what Bumpy Johnson did to cause all these problems you're describing. Did he threaten your bookmakers? Did he pay building inspectors to target your businesses? Did he arrange for your bank accounts to be frozen? Because from what you're telling me, it sounds like you're re-experiencing a series of unfortunate coincidences rather than coordinated attack by someone targeting you specifically." Benedetto collapsed into the chair, his legs apparently unable to support him any longer. "Mr. Costello, these aren't coincidences. This is coordinated destruction of everything I've built. The problem is that I couldn't prove Bumpy Johnson is behind any of it, because he hasn't done anything directly. Nobody has threatened me personally. Nobody has attacked my men or damaged my properties. But every single problem I am experiencing can be traced back to decisions made by people who have relationships with Harlem's criminal networks or who have been contacted by intermediaries, suggesting that it would be in their interest to stop doing business with me. The bookmakers who quit all received visits from union organizers explaining that their families would face difficulties if they continued working in gambling operations that were properly affiliated with recognized organizations. The suppliers who stopped delivering all received calls from their other major customers, saying they were reconsidering their relationships with vendors who did business with people the customers did untrust. The police who returned my protection payments all got instructions from precinct captains, who got instructions from someone in police headquarters, who apparently has connections to someone in Harlem. The building inspectors and health officials and fire marshals are all following up on anonymous complaints that were filed simultaneously about every business I control, and the banks froze my accounts based on suspicious transaction reports filed by someone who identified patterns of deposits and withdrawals that supposedly indicate money laundering activities. Costello absorbed this information, recognition dawning on his face as he understood the sophisticated nature of what Bumpy Johnson had done to Tony Benedetto over the past 72 hours. Not direct attacks that would violate Mafia rules about resolving disputes through proper channels, but rather strategic use of legitimate systems and informal networks to create cascading failures that destroyed Benedetto's operations without any single action being clearly attributable to Bumpy's organization or being obviously illegal or improper in ways that would justify retaliation through normal mob enforcement mechanisms. "Tony, did you receive any warnings during these 72 hours? Did anyone contact you with demands or threats or opportunities to stop this before it got to the point where you're sitting in my office begging for help?" The question was asked to determine whether Benedetto had been given chances to recognize his error and make amends before suffering complete destruction of his operations, which would indicate whether Bumpy was interested in extracting submission and apology, or whether he was simply demonstrating power by crushing someone who had disrespected him in ways that demanded total humiliation rather than negotiated settlement. Nobody contacted me directly, but I received 3 messages over the past 3 days. The first message came on Saturday morning, 12 hours after our meeting at Rouse, delivered by one of my bookmakers who quit that day. He said that someone had suggested to him that working for me was going to become increasingly difficult and that he should find other employment before problems became serious. I ignored that message because I thought it was just one nervous bookmaker overreacting to rumors. The second message came on Sunday evening when my supplier called to say he wouldn't be delivering anymore. He said he had been advised that continuing our business relationship would create conflicts with other clients who were much more important to his company than I was. I was angry about that message, but I still didn't understand that these weren't isolated incidents. The third message came on Monday morning when my banker called to say my accounts were being frozen. He apologized and said that the decision came from senior management after they received information indicating that my accounts were being used for money laundering. and that he had been instructed to tell me that these problems could potentially be resolved if I stopped doing business with people who had made certain other organizations uncomfortable. Benedetto paused, seeming to realize only now what should have been obvious from the beginning. The messages were warnings. Each one was giving me opportunity to contact Bumpy and apologize before things got worse. But I didn't understand what was happening until everything had already collapsed. And by that point it was too late to stop the cascade of failures that destroyed my operations. Costello leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers, and regarding Benedetto with expression that combined disappointment with grudging respect for the precise and devastating way that Bumpy Johnson had responded to being disrespected in ways that would teach lessons not just to Tony Benedetto, but to anyone else in New York's criminal underworld who might be tempted to underestimate black crime bosses or dismiss their capabilities based on racist assumptions about their sophistication and power. Tony, I warned you at the meeting that Bumpy's operation was more substantial than you realized. I told you that the arrangements we've maintained for 13 years work well for everyone involved. I indicated clearly that I wanted you to drop your challenges to those arrangements and respect boundaries that had been established through long history of cooperation. You ignored all of those warnings because you believed your research was better than my knowledge, because you assumed that a black operator could impossibly control organization as large and sophisticated as Bumpy actually controls. And now you're sitting in my office begging me to save you from consequences of your own arrogance and stupidity. The question is why I should help you when you ignored my warnings, disrespected my judgment, and created this problem entirely through your own refusal to listen to people who knew better than you did about realities of how things work in this city. Benedetto's voice dropped to whisper, barely audible across the desk, separating him from Costello. Because if you don't help me, Bumpy Johnson will finish destroying everything I have. And when he has done with me, he'll have demonstrated to every mobster in New York that he has power that none of us recognized. Power that allows him to systematically dismantle Italian operators without ever doing anything that would justify retaliation under our rules. If you let him complete this demonstration without intervening, you'll be sending message that Italian bosses are subordinate to black operators, that challenges to Harlem's arrangements will be met with destruction that we can't prevent or reverse. Help me isn't about saving me personal, I'd say. About maintaining respect for our organization and preventing other people from thinking they can do to us what Bumpy is doing to me. The argument was clever, reframing Benedetto's personal disaster as threat to organizational prestige that required Costello's intervention to protect broader interests rather than to save one foolish capo who had brought problems on himself through his own ignorance and arrogance. Costello considered the argument for approximately 30 seconds before responding with decision that would demonstrate to Tony Benedetto exactly how limited his options had become. Tony, you're right that I need to intervene here, but not for the reasons you're suggesting. I need to intervene because you created problem that threatens relationships I've maintained for more than a decade with Bumpy Johnson, relationships that are valuable to our organization and that I won't allow you to destroy through your stupidity. I'm going to call Bumpy and arrange a meeting where you will apologize formally for disrespecting him at row S4, accusing him of lying about his revenue, for laughing at his warnings, and for any other offenses that he believes require acknowledgement and restitution. You will agree to whatever terms he proposes regarding how your operations will be restructured or eliminated to ensure that you never again pose threat to his territories or his relationships with suppliers and police and banks and other people who have decided that working with you is inconsistent with working with him. And if Bumpy decides that your apology is insufficient and that your continued presence in New York is unacceptable, then you will leave the city permanently and find somewhere else to build whatever criminal career you can salvage from ruins of what you've lost over the past 72 hours. Do you understand? The response made clear that Costello's intervention would not save Tony Benedetto from consequences, but rather would formalize his submission to Bumpy Johnson in ways that established precedents about respect and power dynamics that would govern future interactions between Italian and black criminal organizations in New York. Benedetto nodded slowly. All fight and arrogance drained from him, replaced by desperate acceptance that his only path forward involved complete surrender to someone he had dismissed as small-time operator just 72 hours earlier. I understand, Mr. Costello. Thank you for arranging the meeting. I'll apologize and accept whatever terms Bumpy Johnson demands. Just please make the destruction stop. I can't take another day of watching everything collapse. The meeting between Tony Benedetto and Bumpy Johnson occurred on September 15th, 1948, once again in the back room of Rowe's restaurant, where Benedetto's laughter had precipitated 72 hours of systematic dismantling of his criminal empire. Bumpy arrived exactly on time, accompanied by the same single associate who had attended the previous meeting, his expression neutral and professional, showing no triumph or satisfaction at Benedetto's obvious distress. Frank Costello attended to witness the resolution and ensure that both parties understood terms being established. Tony Benedetto was already waiting when Bumpy entered, standing beside the table rather than sitting, his body language communicating submission before any words were spoken. When Bumpy took his seat, Benedetto remained standing, beginning his apology without prompting or preamble, words rehearsed but delivered with genuine desperation that made clear this was not merely formulaic acknowledgment of error, but rather complete recognition of how profoundly wrong he had been about everything. If you want to discover more stories about how Bumpy Johnson taught entire generations of mobsters that underestimating someone because of their race was the most expensive mistake they could make, subscribe to this channel and leave your like, so more people learn that in 1948, a confident Italian capo learned in 72 hours that Bumpy Johnson's true power was in violence or threats, but rather in systematic control over works, that allowed him to destroy someone completely without ever breaking rules that would justify retaliation, proving once again that the most dangerous people are often the ones who smile quietly while you laugh at their warnings, because they understand that real power does need to announce itself loudly, to be absolutely devastating when it finally acts. Mr. Johnson, I apologize completely and unreservedly for my disrespectful behavior at our previous meeting. I was wrong about your organization's revenue, wrong about your capabilities, wrong about your importance to gambling operations throughout New York, and most importantly, wrong to laugh at your warnings and accuse you of dishonesty in front of Mr. Costello. I understand now that my research was incomplete and my assumptions were based on ignorance rather than knowledge. I accept full responsibility for creating this conflict, and I am prepared to accept whatever terms you consider appropriate for resolving the situation and preventing future problems between our organizations. Benedetto paused, seeming to gather courage for the next part of his statement. I have prepared written documentation transferring ownership of all my gambling operations in the Bronx to your organization, along with lists of my bookmakers and suppliers and protection arrangements with police precincts. I will leave New York City permanently within 7 days and will not attempt to conduct any gambling or criminal operations in any territory where your organization has current or future interests. I ask only that you allow me to keep enough money to start over somewhere else, and that you stop the systematic destruction of my remaining assets so that I have something to work with when I leave. Bumpy listened to Benedetto's complete surrender without interruption, his face revealing nothing about whether he found the apology satisfactory or whether he intended to accept the terms being offered, or whether he had additional demands that would further humiliate the man who had laughed at him 72 hours earlier. When Benedetto finished speaking and stood waiting for response that would determine whether his life as criminal in New York City was permanently over or whether some path existed for partial rehabilitation, Bumpy spoke quietly. Mr. Benedetto, I accept your apology. I understand that you made assumptions based on incomplete information, and I recognize that your disrespect stemmed from ignorance rather than from deliberate insult. However, accepting your apology doesn't change the fact that you attempted to take over territories that belong to my organization, that you dismissed my capabilities in ways that could have encouraged others to make similar mistakes, and that you created situation requiring me to spend considerable time and resources demonstrating to New York's criminal community that challenges to Harlem's arrangements will be met with decisive responses that make clear such challenges are not acceptable. Therefore, my terms are as follows. First, you will transfer all gambling operations in the Bronx to my organization, as you've offered. Second, you will leave New York City permanently within 7 days, as you've proposed. Third, you will provide written statement to Mr. Costello explaining exactly what I did to dismantle your operations over the past 72 hours, including the names of all suppliers, police contacts, bank officials, and other people who participated in your destruction, so that everyone understands how comprehensive my network of influence extends throughout this city. And fourth, you will keep enough money to start over somewhere else. I'm not interested in leaving you destitute, just in making sure you never return to challenge arrangements that have worked well for more than a decade. Do you accept these terms?" The terms were simultaneously generous and devastating. Benedetto, to escape with his life and enough money to rebuild elsewhere, while also forcing him to document publicly the extent of Bumpy's power in ways that would discourage anyone else from making similar challenges. Benedetto nodded immediately, relief evident despite humiliation of having to provide written account of his own destruction. "I accept all terms, Mr. Johnson. Thank you for allowing me to leave with something rather than destroying me completely. I'll have the documentation of your network's actions prepared within 2 days, and I'll be gone from New York before the end of next week. You have my word that I'll never return or attempt any operations in territories where you have interests." The final statement was delivered with absolute sincerity, making clear that Tony Benedetto had learned his lesson thoroughly and would never again make assumptions about someone's power based on surface appearances or racist stereotypes about capabilities of black crime bosses. The story of Tony Benedetto's 72-hour destruction by Bumpy Johnson became legendary in New York's criminal underworld, told and retold in bars and social clubs, and during private conversations between mobsters who wanted to understand how power actually worked in a city where formal hierarchies and racial assumptions often obscured real relationships and networks that determined who could operate successfully and who would be crushed if they overstepped boundaries that were obvious until they were violated. The written documentation that Benedetto provided to Frank Costello revealed the full scope of Bumpy's influence, showing that he controlled or significantly influenced approximately 40% of the suppliers who provided goods and services to gambling operations throughout Manhattan and the Bronx, that he had relationships with police officials at levels ranging from precinct captains to division commanders who coordinated enforcement activities across multiple precincts, that he had banking contacts who could initiate suspicious transaction investigations against anyone whose accounts processed gambling revenue, and that he had connections with union organizers and building inspectors and health department officials who could create legitimate problems for businesses without any obvious coordination or criminal conspiracy that would violate laws or mob rules about how disputes should be resolved. What made Bumpy's response to Tony Benedetto so impressive to other mobsters was not the speed or completeness of Benedetto's destruction, though both were remarkable, but rather the fact that every action taken against Benedetto was technically legal and procedurally Inspectors were responding to anonymous complaints about actual violations that did exist, even if they were minor infractions, that normally would have been overlooked. Banks were following required protocols for investigating suspicious transactions that did meet technical criteria for reporting, even if they were common practices in gambling operations. Police were refusing protection payments based on legitimate concerns about corruption investigations that could endanger officers who accepted money from bookmakers without proper political cover. Bumpy had demonstrated that his true power lay not in ability to threaten or kill people who opposed him, but rather in ability to manipulate legitimate systems to produce outcomes that were just as devastating as direct violence, while being completely immune to retaliation because nothing he did violated rules or norms that governed how criminal organizations could respond to challenges. Tony Benedetto left New York on September 21st, 1948, exactly 10 days after he had laughed at Bumpy Johnson's warning. During their meeting at Roe's restaurant, he moved to Miami, where he attempted to rebuild his gambling operations in a city that was experiencing rapid growth and seemed to offer opportunities for someone with his experience and connections. But the reputation he carried with Hamas, the Italian mobster who had been destroyed in 72 hours by a black crime boss he had dismissed a small time, preceded him to Florida and colored every interaction he had with other criminals who wondered whether associating with someone who had been so thoroughly humiliated would create problems with their own operations or relationships. Benedetto struggled for 3 years to establish himself in Miami, before finally giving up and moving to Las Vegas in 1951, where he worked as low-level manager in a casino owned by associates of the Genovese family, who gave him employment more out of pity than because they valued his capabilities. He died in 1967, at age 50, having never recovered the status or wealth or confidence he had possessed before, making the catastrophic error of laughing at a warning from someone whose power he failed to understand until it destroyed him completely. Frank Costello maintained his relationship with Bumpy Johnson until both men retired from active criminal leadership in the late 1950s and early 1960s. And Costello frequently cited the Benedetto incident when younger mobsters asked him about why the family continued honoring arrangements with black operators in Harlem despite having theoretical power to take over those operations directly. Bumpy Johnson taught us an important lesson in 1948. Costello would explain, "He showed us that real power isn't about muscle or threats or territory. It's about understanding systems well enough to manipulate them to produce outcomes you want without ever doing anything that looks criminal or improper. That kind of power is more valuable than armies of soldiers or political connections or bank accounts, because it allows you to destroy enemies without creating situations where rules require you to retaliate." Tony Benedetto learned that lesson the hard way, and anyone else who thinks about challenging Harlem's arrangements should remember what happened to him when he laughed at someone whose warning he should have taken seriously.